Training is crucial for performance, improvement, and cohesiveness. It's also one of the most expensive investments we'll ever make. Getting it right can make a massive positive impact on our business. And when we don't see results from training, it can cause tremendous frustrations. In this 6-part series, I'm going to share the guidelines for training I've established for myself after many years of learning what works and what doesn't.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
Conducting effective training and education of our employees is one of the handful of initiatives I can directly point to and say, this is why our company grew at the rate it did, and why I was able to step away from the day-to-day. Remember, when I sold my shares of my company, I was only working 3 days a week. Most days were full days, but they weren't 10 solid hour days like they were in the beginning. And this is one of, again, the handful of things I can point to and say, the reason I was able to do this is because I had a team of employees who I could trust to make solid decisions and didn't require a lot of oversight. And the only way that happened was because we devoted a tremendous amount of time consistently over many years to teach them all the things that we knew that made our company successful. And it's a massive investment of time, energy, and money. Because of that, it's not uncommon for training to be on the short list of actions we're perpetually going to get to and do more of and do a better job of at some point in the future. It's kind of like that joke, what day do most diets begin? Tomorrow or next Monday? Training is kind of like that for a lot of us. And part of the reason is it's so often pushed aside is it's not something we generally get a chance to learn from someone who's really good at it. When I ask, business owners and business leaders, like, who have you worked for that did a great job with training? Most of the time, it's a pretty short list. So this is not something that we just have a huge group of people who have showed us how to do this effectively. What we've almost always seen is the same thing, which is the business leader, business owner, the boss, the manager, the whatever, stands in front of the room, makes a presentation. They have, an hour carved out. They're going to cover 16 topics and they devote 3 minutes each one. The meeting runs long. There's, we ask if there's questions at the end. I joke about that a lot in here. Like, we tell them the thing and ask if there's any questions, and everybody nods and smiles when they're supposed to, and they shake their head no when they're supposed to, and the meeting is adjourned. And then 3 hours later, we find out nothing changed. And that's just kind of how most of us, especially for people my age, that's how most of us grew up seeing quote unquote training. And so for most of us, we don't have people who can show us what, how this is really supposed to go. So we're not often eager to invest lots of time, energy, and money into tasks and actions. We're not confident we're going to do well. And for those of us who are already making the investment of carving out time to educate and train employees, it can sometimes feel like a complete waste because we don't see the kind of improvement of substantial investment like this should warrant. And so we get pessimistic and we get uneasy and unsure and like, why are we doing this? Like we're spending all this time to get everybody together and things aren't really changing and it's not working as well as I want. So we tend to do it quicker or less frequent because it's not working. Now, as I've mentioned many times before in this podcast, I have been unusually blessed in my career by having mentors who are fantastic at training and education and teaching teams and they were willing to teach me the specific strategies that worked. I know that that's not, common for everyone. But that I was very blessed with that. And like everyone else, I've also seen what unproductive training looks like. And I've learned a lot from those people as well. I also have now over 25 years of experience educating and conducting training under my belt with plenty of lessons learned the hard way. There maybe more than most people I know. I have done things the wrong way many, many times, especially early in my career. I, as I was, before I knew there was a way to do this, I did it wrong. As I learned that there was a way to do this, as I tried, I did it wrong. And it's just time and consistency, excuse me, and sticking with it. And I've also found some strategies and tactics that have been proven to consistently work for me. Now, like nearly all things I talk about here in the beginning, again, 25 years ago, I was not very good at transferring knowledge I had to others in a way they would remember and then actually apply that knowledge. And I can remember like it was yesterday how frustrating and embarrassing it was, and also how it came to feel like a massive waste of time. Just use this huge burden. Like, I know we're supposed to do this thing, but sometimes like, why do I bother? It doesn't change anything. I remember feeling like that. Now, lucky for me, now looking back, it didn't feel lucky at the time, but I was in a situation where I had little choice but to get better. I mean, my job was on the line in the beginning, and then later on, if I wanted to advance, like this was a critical skill I had to learn. And now I would argue that effectively training employees is one of the things this is right in my wheelhouse now. This is one of my top skill sets, I would say. And the reason for that is not because I was born with some special skills or abilities. As I've mentioned, I was not. It's only because I learned specific strategies and now have many years of getting the reps in. It's just, we talk about, in life, we talk about, everything's like riding a bike. You just, you fall off and skin your knee in the beginning, and then pretty soon you're riding wheelies with no hands. This is very much like that. I was not a savant when it came to this stuff by any means. I just have lots of years of practice. And nothing I will share here requires anything more than a desire to effectively conduct training and a willingness to stick to some guidelines. And you may hear some that you think are completely nuts, and that's okay. These are the ones I stick to because they've worked for me. And I hope these rules, tips, and guidelines will help you make better and faster progress on the topics you are or will be teaching your team. So let's get started. The first one is my number one rule in training is this. If just telling them worked, I wouldn't be having this problem. It would already be fixed, and this conversation I'm having now wouldn't even be necessary. And I'll tell this story again quickly because you've heard it before if you listened before. But when I was a young supervisor in my early to mid 20, I think I was 24. I supervised a team of people who worked second shift. My boss, the operations manager, went home at 5 every day, and then my shift started at 2 or 3 or something like that. And there was a couple hour overlap. But then I ran the crew till 10 o'clock at night. And there was a period of time where my team was just not performing very well. And my boss, Bill, calls me into his office one day and sits me down and is like, "What's going on here? Things aren't really going that well. And here's the areas, and here's the metrics, and here's the things that we're not doing very well." And I remember like it was yesterday looking at Bill and going, "Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know what the deal is. I tell these guys all the time that these are the things we need to do." And he said, "You think that's why we have you here? Like, you think what we want you to do is stand in front of these people, whether one-on-one or in the group, and like just tell them things? That's what you think this role is?" And I remember just being instantly embarrassed and shocked and felt pretty silly and pretty stupid, honestly. And just thinking like, well, if it's not that, then what? I didn't have the answer what I was supposed to do. And his point made sense. Like, no, of course that's not what I'm supposed to do. But if not that, then what? So thus began my journey of learning actual strategies and tactics to communicate things and educate people and train them and things like that. But here's the main lesson I got out of that. If just telling them worked, I wouldn't be having this conversation. Anything that I'm training people on that they're not doing the way we need it to be done, the customer's not being taken care of, the company's needs aren't being served, whatever it is, anything like that, I've likely already told them, quote unquote, told them at least once. And if telling them the first time works, awesome. Check that box and move on. But if it didn't work, that means telling them doesn't work. There's a reason that didn't work. And that is my number one rule in training is if just telling them worked, I wouldn't be having this conversation. Therefore, in this conversation, Even though it feels like it'll be really efficient just to quickly tell them this thing, that's not the strategy for me to use. I need to do something different than just telling them. And what I've learned is having more conversations and dialogue and asking questions and things like that is way better than just telling them. So that's my number one rule. If I could only impart one thing upon my children, if they were going to be leaders in companies, that would be it. So number two, well, real quick on one thing. One of the things that I laugh about for myself is before I learned this, I would, quote unquote, tell them, like in the case where Bill like pulled me aside and was like, "Hey, what's going on here? This isn't working." My case to him was I told him like numerous times, like I've told him like 27 times that this is how we do the thing. And it still felt on the 28th time like it would be really efficient and effective for me to tell them the 28th time. In the moment, I know it feels like that. And that's why that's my number one rule, is because I have to force myself to break out of that way of thinking. All right, moving on. Next one. Similar but different. Questions are infinitely more effective when teaching than statements are. In my experience, as I said, conversations create all the elements we really want. Conversations create engagement. Conversations and questions create willing participation and buy-in. Traditional training, where I stand in front of a group of my team of 40 people or 50 people or 6 people or one-on-one and just tell them things, does not create engagement, willing participation, and buy-in. Lectures and presentations do not do that. Like it or not, again, I'm not saying that I'm happy that this is the way it is. It would be life. My life would be a lot easier if it wasn't. But like it or not, people just tune out of lectures and presentations. Tuned out people are not engaged. And without engagement, there's generally not much commitment. If there's not commitment on their part, that means I have to babysit it. I have to ensure it happens. I have to see it through and double check things and all this stuff that we don't like. Lectures and presentations lead to that. Conversations and me asking questions and stop talking where they have to answer, even if there's that awkward silence, is infinitely more effective when teaching or training or educating than just making presentations and doing lectures. This is my experience. Again, you may have a group where you're like, no, that doesn't make any sense for I tell them one time and like, boom, it's done. Okay, then awesome. I'm happy for you. That has not been my experience. And the third one I'm going to cover today is kind of the traditional 80-20 rule. When training, I follow an 80-20 rule. I want to be talking 20% of the time or less. And the main reason is because I can't diagnose where they get it and where they don't get it, and therefore which part of the training conversation must be had when I'm talking. So, for example, if I'm teaching communication, we were okay when we assumed everyone had the same idea of what was quote unquote good communication. We became excellent, like noticeably excellent, after having many conversations where people spoke up about what their version of quote unquote good communication actually was for us. It was an entirely different conversation. So, in the earlier days when I would just stand there and say communication is really important, like we have these 5 points of contact on every customer, every job or whatever, we were okay. I still had complaints from people we weren't communicating the way we said we were and things like that. But when I stopped doing that and I started asking, what does good communication for us look like? And why does it matter that we do those things? And what do we do in those moments when we know we need to make that phone call, but we were tied up with other things? When I had started having those kinds of conversations, I was able to diagnose where they got it and where they didn't. And the parts they got, I didn't have to dwell on. The parts they didn't get, I need to spend more attention and time and energy training those things. I cannot detect where they get it and where they don't if I'm talking. They're going to nod and smile no matter what. Whether they're nodding and smiling is not an indication that they really get it. And I certainly can't detect where they think they got it, and they're completely wrong if I'm talking. They may be sitting there going the whole time, "Oh, yeah, this all makes perfect sense," and completely be on the wrong track, and completely have the wrong idea of what success looks like, and completely have the wrong idea of how we do this thing. But in their mind, if they think they understand it, they're just going to nod and smile. And it's not possible for me to detect it if that's what's happening, if I'm the one doing the talking. So those are the three I'm going to cover in this episode. Again, this is a 6-part series. I'm going to cover another 10 or so that I have that are just, again, guidelines for me, things that I've learned that make it so that I'm way more effective now than I was many, many years ago, and even just 10 years ago. There's things I've learned over the last 10 years that we're going to get into that have made it so that when I do training and community and education with the team, it's much more effective. And actually, I can see results within a short amount of time rather than having those frustrations of, I can remember times where we would literally have a meeting. We had our meeting on Tuesday mornings. We would literally have a meeting at 7:00 in the morning and be done by 8:30 or whatever time the meeting was over with. And by noon, I would get a phone call that the thing we had just covered in that meeting that day didn't happen the way we trained it. And it's funny now, but man, was that frustrating. And that stuff stopped happening when I started following these guidelines. So anyhow, that's the 3 we're going to cover in this episode. As usual, this could be a 6-part series on training. And I don't know a single business owner that doesn't have some kind of frustration with training. So as usual, if you find the information I share helpful, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague you think could benefit from it. Of course, public sharing is always appreciated as well. That's it for this week. I'll talk to y'all next week.